Good afternoon, and welcome to the College of Continuing and Professional Studies webinar, Leading Through Change Resistance. Thank you so much for joining me today. Next slide, please. My name is Beth Laurie, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. If you have future questions about this webinar or other programs that CCAPS offers, the college's contact information will be on the last slide of our presentation. I'm delighted to introduce the topic for today's webinar, Leading Through Change Resistance. People resist change, even when it's good for them. So what can leaders do about it? Change is inevitable, but resistance doesn't have to derail it. This interactive session equips mid-level managers and organizational leaders with the psychological frameworks, practical strategies, and change management tools needed to guide their teams from resistance to readiness. We'll explore the neuroscience behind why our brains resist change, learn how to identify where your team is in the change journey, and walk away with proven strategies to move people from resistance to genuine adoption. This isn't a lecture. It's a practical, interactive experience designed for leaders who want to be better prepared the next time change lands on their team's doorstep. In this webinar, we'll acknowledge the psychological effects of change, explore foundational change resistance strategies, and apply change resistance tools. It is our pleasure to introduce the presenter for today's webinar, Duriel Johnson. Duriel has over 15 years of experience leading enterprise-wide transformations for Fortune 100 companies, specializing in large-scale initiatives that span retail, healthcare, and global supply chains. A University of Minnesota alumnus and certified change practitioner, Duriel currently guides AI adoption strategies in the financial services sector to modernize workforce operations and technology integration. Duriel, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your wisdom on this important topic. I'll now pass it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Beth. I appreciate that. And thank you all for joining me today. Really excited to be here. And as Beth said, I'm an alumnus. So for me to have the opportunity to come back and do something with the university that I graduated from as an undergrad is just very excited about. So I want to start off by reading you this quote. Change is hard because people overestimate the value of what they have, and they underestimate the value of what they may gain by giving that up. Now, I love this quote because it's really not the change itself that people resist. It's the loss they feel. Even when change is perceived as favorable, there's still that loss of familiarity that comes along with it. And the value of change is difficult to fully appreciate until people experience it for themselves. And so in a little bit, we're going to dig into some of the reasons why people react that way to change. I'm going to move past this. I think Beth just broke that out. We're going to focus on 3 different sections: discovery, planning, and action. But I do want to call out before we dive into the content that there will be some interactivity that I'm going to use. It's a program called Slido. And what you'll see is an image similar to what you see on the right side of your screen. There will be a question that I'll have for you, and you'll respond by using your camera phone to scan the QR code. You don't need to scan anything right now. This is just there for example purposes. Once we get to that slide, I'll provide you with the example that, or for the instructions that you need. I just ask that you keep your cell phones nearby. All right, section 1, discovery. Let's talk a little bit about the psychological effects of change. All right, so in a minute, I'm going to play a short video that's going to give you an explanation for why our brains find change difficult. The woman in the video is Hillary Scarlett. and she is the author of a book titled Neuroscience for Organizational Change. So I just want you all just to listen, take in some of the key points, and then I want to hear a little bit of your thoughts on what you heard.
Our brains find change difficult because for our brains it's all about survival. That's the key thing they want to do, is help us survive. So in order to help us survive, there's two key things our brains are constantly trying to do. It's about avoiding threat and it's about seeking reward. But most of all, it's about avoiding threat. To avoid threat, what our brains want to do is they want to be able to predict, because if they can predict what's going to happen, they can protect us better. And what change means is they can't predict because they don't know what's going to happen. So when our brains are faced by change, particularly change that we can't control, they go into a threat state. They go into flight or fight. People will be familiar with the term. And when that happens, literally in our brains, blood goes to those parts of the brain that gets you ready to run away or to fight, and away from the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain where we do all our thinking and planning and analytical thinking. So when we're going through change, our brains get ready for this flight or fight state and get distracted, feel very threatened. We begin to see threats in the workplace where they don't even exist. Any threats that are there, we see them as much bigger than they really are. We start to see colleagues as being a bit of a threat. And we're constantly distracted, trying to make sense of, will I be all right? Will I be okay? And in fact,
All right, I'm just going to go ahead and pause it right there. So using that chat feature, I'm curious to hear what you thought about what you just heard. Were there any key themes or key words that kind of resonated with you? What do you think about what you just heard about why our brains find change difficult? And Beth, let me know if anything is coming through.
Absolutely. We have lots of comments to your question. Control. Let's see. It's unpredictable. It's about survival.
Yes,
People have differing tolerances for changes.
absolutely.
Threat.
Yes,
Want,
threats and
want,
rewards, right?
want.
So if you think about that, our brains are constantly trying to seek rewards. But naturally, all of the things that are happening around us are perceived as threats, right? Even if they're not, we perceive them as threats. And, for myself, I think one of the biggest takeaways from this video is just really recognizing that people who resist change are not bad people. They're just human, right? It's not defiance, it's really just science because our brains are really hardwired to avoid those threats and seek those rewards. So every time I work with leaders and they have people, oh, these people, they're resisting, they're not listening, right? But they don't understand that change is really, really difficult for us. And so I thought it was important for you all to kind of have that foundation of kind of what's happening from a neurological standpoint as we talk about change. So next, let's talk about what it feels like on the surface when people are experiencing change. And some of you all may be familiar with this model. It's known as the Kubler-Ross change curve. And it was developed by a psychiatrist, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, originally based on her 5 stages of grief, based on her work of emotions of death and dying. Now, I know that's pretty heavy, but change can sometimes feel similar to the grief people feel when they are dying or when they lose a loved one. So think back to the quote that I read in the beginning. It's not the change that people resist, it's the loss they feel. So by understanding the different processes or stages that people go through during grief of change, this can help you better tailor your change strategy. So let's take a look at these. So the first phase when someone's going through change, oftentimes is denial. So this is where people feel overwhelmed. Sometimes they're shocked. They may not even believe the change really has to happen. And the best way that you can support someone that's going through the denial phase is to make it crystal clear about what's changing, why it's changing, and when it's changing. Like the change has to be real for them to move forward. But oftentimes people go from denial and then they slip into anger, right? And so this is when people start having conflicts. They may say things that they wouldn't normally say in a work setting. You may see people placing blames on others, saying things like, this is not fair. And this is really where you need that one-on-one leadership support during this phase and utilize any of your company resources that you may have to really kind of guide them through that part of that phase. And then what typically happens is, people are angry, but then they go, wait a minute, maybe there's a way out of this, or maybe I can kind of shift the narrative a different way. And so they start to bargain with you, right? And so this is where people may, try to come up with, hey, can we do it a different way? Can we maybe put off this and do a go live later on at a different point? But it's really important to let their feelings be heard, but you have to be really clear on any non-negotiables. So you don't want to promise anything that you don't have control over, or something that you can't commit to. And then we have kind of the rock bottom where people kind of get to that depression phase. And this is where people really start to feel hopeless and unmotivated. This is probably the toughest phase for a change leader to manage because they've kind of almost given up. They're almost kind of in this neutral, like, I don't really care what happens next. And so this is really where you want to try and work with their feelings, work with those leaders, and really connect them back to the purpose of the change and help them look for ways to kind of process it and really make it more rewarding. So, if you think about threats and rewards, what kind of rewards can kind of help them get to the next phase, which is acceptance? And this is at this point, everyone recognizes, hey, the change is going to happen and I'm going to accept it. I may be happy about it. I may be reluctant about it, but at some point, people are going to get to the level of acceptance. And this is where people are kind of stop resisting and they're going to be moving forward, kind of with the next change. But a couple of things I want to call out here is these phases don't always happen in order. They're not always sequential, and people can slide back to a previous phase. So even after someone gets to the acceptance phase, it's really important for you all to check back in on them semi-regularly, monitor how they're doing, because sometimes people get to the acceptance phase really quick and then something happens and now they're back in a previous phase. So this is a really good model to kind of think about as you're thinking about the people that are impacted by change. All right. So we're going to look at another behavioral model. And this one is known as SCARF, which is an acronym for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And so what this is a science-based framework. It was originally developed by Dr. David Rock of the Neuro Leadership Institute. And if you're not familiar with that organization, they do global research and they really look at how does neuroscience affect business leadership and organizational change. Highly recommend you check out their content if you really have an interest in this area. But, similar to the video we just watched a little bit ago, this model focuses on 5 social domains that can trigger a brain's reward or threat response in social situations. And although this model was not created specifically for managing change, I feel it's great for change leaders because it alerts you to people's core motivators, and that can really help you tailor your change resistance approach to each individual. So let's quickly go over the 5 social domains that you see here. The first one is status, less than or better than. So we kind of have that natural drive to want to stand up for the crowd. A person with this scarf domain may have thoughts of like, previously I was the expert, now I don't have the same level of experience. Think about when someone was in a legacy system that they had for a number of years, and now we're moving to this new system, and now everyone is fresh. We don't know kind of what's going to happen. A lot of times people are having that status domain. The next is certainty, knowing what to expect. As humans, we want to know what's going on. We want to be able to predict what's going to happen, if you think back to the prior video. So this is probably the most common domain that you'll see someone go through during change. The next is autonomy, sense of control. So if we think back to the Kubler-Ross curve, there was that bargaining phase that was in the middle. People want to have some say of how the change is going to affect them. And if we start to micromanage them, that's going to create a strong threat response. So giving people even a little bit of autonomy can really go a long way in reducing resistance. And then we have relatedness, in-group versus out-group. As humans, our sense of connection and belonging is really important to us. And if we started feeling like we're excluded or we're an outsider, that can really cause a threat response. So we really want to make sure that we're building trust and camaraderie, so that we feel safe, and that we're able to be collaborative. And then last is fairness, perception of equitable exchange. And so, as people, we innately want to feel a sense of equity in all sorts social situations. If we perceive that something is unequal or there's favoritism to another person or another group, that is really going to have a negative effect on someone that's trying to work through change. So those are all the 5 social domains, and I know we went through those relatively quickly. But hopefully they all make sense, because next we're going to run through a couple mock scenarios. So I do want you to bring your cell phones out and get ready to scan the QR code on the next slide. So you can see it here in your upper left corner. You can go ahead and scan that right now. If for some reason you can't use your camera phone, you can go to slido.com and just type in that number, and that'll bring you to the same slide. So let me read the scenario for you all. Mary, a remote worker, was just informed that she must work 3 days on site a week. Mary asked, "Can I at least choose what days I come on site? This is going to make it difficult to coordinate daycare pickup for my son." What SCARF domain is Mary experiencing? Is it status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, or fairness? And so far, it looks like we have quite a bit of folks that have selected autonomy, about 77%. Certainty hovering around 17%, about 5% for fairness, nothing with status yet, and nothing with relatedness. Okay. Yeah, I mean, the reality is, right, she's probably experiencing more than one of these scarf threats, but just really based on this scenario, the biggest thing is autonomy. It's very likely that Mary's willing to accept the change, but she wants to have some say in how that's going to work. And I think we've seen that a lot as companies are starting to bring people back to work, and they're making that transition from having the autonomy to work at home to going back into the office. So thank you all for participating in that one. And we're going to do just one more example. Go ahead and scan that again if you need to. Jamal, a respected data analyst, just learned his role is being reorganized under a new team. He doesn't know any of his new teammates, nor anything about his new boss. And if you didn't realize already, you can select more than one if you so choose. Status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And let's see, we got quite a bit for certainty, about 79% of the audience. 50% for relatedness. Let's see, about 37% for status, 5% for autonomy, and about 4% for fairness. Yeah, the reality, anytime that we're having to shift to a new team, especially if it's just us and the whole team is not shifting with you, you're probably going to fill all 5 of these scarf domains. But certainly status, relatedness, and certainty are ones that I really see called out here. So thank you all for participating in that. And we will move on to the next section, section 2, planning. All right, so I have yet another curve model that I want to go over with you all. And this one is referred to as the commitment change curve. So whereas the Kubler-Ross curve that you saw a little bit ago illustrates the different emotions people experience during change, the one you see here, it really kind of depicts the pathway leaders should follow when guiding their teams throughout their change journey. And I will say too, there are many different variations of this change curve out there. If you're going to do an internet search, you're going to see all types of different models that are referred to as the commitment change curve. But I like this one because it not only shows the optimal pathway forward, which is represented by the gold curve on the top, it also shows what happens when the phases are either mishandled or skipped in any way. And that's represented by that maroon colored downward curve on the bottom. All right, so let's talk through the different phases of this change curve, starting with awareness. So with any change project, people have to become aware of the change at some point. And so this is where individuals really get introduced to that future state, what's going to happen next. However, if people are not, excuse me, if people are not aware of the change in a timely manner, or if they're providing with conflicting information. Sometimes we get that initial information from maybe one leader, and then later on we get a little bit of different information. That can lead to confusion. So we make sure we want to be crystal clear and that we're providing that same message to everyone. And then from there, we can move into understanding. So now that we have awareness, this is where individuals have to understand what is going to be the impact of change for themselves. Not just organizationally what's happening, but where do I see myself? How is this going to impact my day-to-day role in an organization? And if those details are unclear, or if people don't perceive the change benefits them in any way, they're likely going to start to distrust and fear the outcome of the change. But if you can get them past that to acceptance, that is really the sweet spot in change. And that's where people start to feel confident enough to accept a change. And then they start feeling accountability to making it happen as well. One thing I'm going to call out though is people do not have to like the change to accept it. I work with leaders a lot and they spend a lot of time really trying to sell the change, trying to get people to like the change. Obviously, it makes it easier if they like it, but they don't necessarily have to. They just need to feel supported and be provided with the right tools and information to move from current state to future state. But if not, they're going to develop skepticism. As you see on that downward side of the curve, they can start to have denial about if this transition is worth it for them. So really important to get them to that middle part. And the reality is you're going to have some people that just get to the acceptance phase and they may stop there. They may not go beyond that. But for others, they're going to move into adoption. And that's where they're not only accepting the phase, but they're actually championing it. They see it as a benefit not to themselves, but they also see it as a benefit to others. And that can really, really help benefit a change is when you start to see those impacted be influencers for you. So that's really a great place to be, is to have those people in adoption. But if for any reason people are misled or they're overpromised something about the change, they can get to adoption and then revert back to a previous phase, and even sabotage the project. So you really want to be careful with those folks because those are going to be your change champions, your influencers for the project. And then last is ownership. And that just represents that the future state has been achieved and now the new way of behaving and doing business is in place. So this model can be a good way to structure your change plan. Imagine a document that has all of these different phases that are listed out. And then within each phase, you have different tactics that you're going to implement to move them to the next phase. And then consider kind of any mitigation tactics you may have to avoid anything that you see on that downward side of the change curve. All right. So, one of the most practical tools that you'll see in change management is creating a stakeholder analysis. You'll see this in project management as well. And this is intended to be a living document, not just a one-time exercise. And it really can be as detailed as you need it to be. The core idea is basically not everyone is affected by a change or has the same needs as everyone else. So you want to kind of look at each individual or each individual group and think about different tactics to help them along. And so some people have high influence on whether a change is successful, and others have high interest, but little formal power. So The first thing you want to do is really kind of list out, you can either do it like with individuals. The best way to do it if it's a large scale change, though, that's going to affect many people is to list out the groups or the teams that are going to be affected by the change. But don't just default to job titles. Think about who actually is going to feel the impact. And then think about the level of influence or interest. So when I talk about influence, in this particular document, this is the degree of authority or control stakeholders have over the success or direction of the change. And so high influence stakeholders can really help or they can hinder regardless of how they personally feel about that. And then when I talk about interest, that represents the degree to which a stakeholder is personally affected and invested in the outcome of the change. So essentially, how much the change will alter their day-to-day work, not necessarily their level of enthusiasm for the change. And then lastly, you want to match each stakeholder to a specific engagement strategy. So high influence, high interest people, you really need more involvement. Low influence, high interest people often need more transparency than persuasion, because that's a group that can quietly derail a project. So you really want to be careful with those stakeholders. And then as the project moves along, you'll likely add, you'll tweak, you'll change certain things, but this really becomes a foundation for all of your change management activities moving forward. All right, and then we'll talk a little bit about some change resistant strategies. And there's really a myriad of strategies that I could go over with you today, but we don't have a lot of time. But hopefully you all will decide to actually sign up for the full certificate course, and we'll do a deeper dive into some of these. But regardless of the type of change, there's really kind of four foundational tactics that you can take or approach. And the first one is you always want to anticipate resistance. So always assume with change that there's going to be some level of resistance, even if the change is going to be viewed as positive. It's always better to be proactive versus reactive to change. And on the next slide, I'm going to actually show you a tool that can help you do that. Assess readiness. So don't assume just because people have awareness and understanding of the change that they're ready to move forward. So prior to go live, you want to make sure that you're checking in with the different groups that are going to be impacted, ensuring that they're engaged, answering questions that they have, and just truly making sure that they are ready to move forward. I don't know how many times I've seen in organizations where the project moves along, the project is great, and then once it rolls out, they've recognized these people really weren't ready for it. We didn't address any of the concerns they had. And then they're having to go back to square one. You don't want to have that happen. So make sure that you're assessing that readiness along the way. And importantly, make sure that you're communicating regularly. So think back to the video that I showed you earlier in the presentation. Our brains want to predict what is going to happen. So the more you communicate, the less uncertainty there will be. And then make sure that you're utilizing recognition and rewards because they're important motivators for adoption. And especially if you're in a situation where the change is not going to directly benefit those that are impacted, you really want to leverage recognition and rewards. Okay, so now let's look at some tools that can help you drive change resistance based on the resistant items that we just went over. So one of the most effective ways that you can proactively anticipate resistance is by facilitating what I refer to as a persona mapping exercise. And you can see things like this used in different industries. I know marketing and advertisement utilizes this a lot, but this also can be very helpful in change management. And so persona mapping really is just a process of creating a semi-fictional user profile to identify the needs, the concerns, and the gaps of those who are going to be directly impacted by the change. And the ultimate objective is to identify what you want the personas to represent. So what do you want them to know? What do you want them to do? And what do you want them to feel? And so by first identifying areas of change that they may be most concerned about. And so an example that you see here, I have a description of a fictional person named Jim. But Jim is part of a real team. He's a recruiter, but he's a new enroll recruiter that's going to be impacted. And so for this particular thing that we're rolling out a workday, and all recruiters are going to be impacted in some way, but this person is going to be impacted probably in another way because he's new to the role and also has to learn this new system. So then I've also included the scarf domain, the Kubler-Ross change curve that we're anticipating this person or these groups of people would be at. And I typically do this exercise with, some of those key stakeholders that really are knowledgeable about these persona groups and are knowledgeable about probably the concerns that they are going to have. So you're not going to want to just do this yourself. And then, once the exercise is complete, next steps will be to kind of develop an action plan that you want to have to mitigate any resistance that you see. And then you can also use this too to kind of move forward with your communication strategy too, because you'll have an idea of what you want them to know, do, and feel. And then based on that, you can tailor your communication to those stakeholders. So another great tool for assessing readiness is to actually send out a readiness survey to people who are going to be impacted by the change. And the purpose of this type of survey is really to gauge how prepared people are for the upcoming change. Again, you don't want to just assume people are ready to make that change. You want to see evidence that they are ready to move forward. And then ultimately, you want to identify the areas of concerns they may have. Are there misunderstandings that the group may have? Are there any barriers that can negatively impact the implementation? And you can do this survey in a lot of different ways. I just have one example that you see here on the slide, but a couple of things you want to consider before sending this out. Timing is key. So you want to deploy a readiness survey after the awareness and understanding phase, but you want to do it with at least enough time to react to the results and even shift your strategy if necessary. And so this information can really be helpful too if you happen to work with a training team. So sometimes I'll send out the readiness surveys and it'll kind of give me insight into areas that training should focus on more or less on based on the readiness. And so I'll usually share the results with those teams. And so that really helps. Make sure that the survey is anonymous because you want people to feel comfortable sharing their true feelings. And then lastly, I know the example that I have on the screen, it says readiness survey, but those words can sometimes make people feel like they're being judged negatively. So you may want to consider a different name if you actually send this out. You may have something like, pulse survey, or you may say something like, your change, your perspective, your voice matters. Something that sounds just a little bit more encouraging sometimes than just saying a readiness survey, but it's still getting at the same thing. Okay, and then communication is a big piece of change, managing change resistance. And really, communication can literally make or break a change initiative. Remember, we need understanding and awareness before we can move to acceptance. So having a formal communication plan is a must. And if you take a look at the example that I have here, again, you can make your communication plan look however you want. There's so many different variations you can do. But for this one, I'm using a fictional company, Grey Duck Inc. And if you notice, I have seven different communication tactics that goes across three different change phases. So they kind of start broad with the HR town hall to build awareness, and then it kind of narrows down with tools like a leadership playbook that's going to help the leaders. Because the closer someone is to guiding others through change, the more support you want to give those folks. And then if you notice too, in the frequency column, some communications are like one-time events, like if you have like a town hall, but others are more ongoing or recurring, like the newsletter and the FAQs. And the reality is people are not going to absorb everything in one message. So you have to send out multiple messages for them to retain it. There has to be repetition. You need different formats, and you also want to have different senders as well that are going to be important to those being impacted. And then notice too that the tactics kind of evolve along the change curve. Awareness tactics are kind of broad in the beginning, and then they're kind of top down. So you have the FAQs, the demos, And then for acceptance, you have tactics like, maybe a SharePoint site that's going to have some information, and then support during training. So everything here is intentional. You really want to be thoughtful for it. And just like the stakeholder analysis, this also can be kind of a living document that may change over time. But you definitely want to be strategic about how you communicate to people, because you can lose them if don't do this right. All right, and then we have recognition and rewards. And I would say too that this is probably the most underutilized tool in change management. I think oftentimes leaders just think, hey, they're going to have to go through change because they don't have a choice. And while that may be true, you're going to have a lot smoother time getting people through change if there's some type of recognition and rewards. Think back to the video that was earlier. We want to seek rewards and avoid threats. So why not help them do that? And so just to distinguish between recognition and rewards, rewards are really those tangible acknowledgments. They can be, a handwritten note, maybe a public praise by a senior leader. And then rewards are more of those tangible things. It could be gift cards, it could be some kind of financial reward, a bonus, maybe even time off or something like that. But some of the best practices when you are thinking about recognition and rewards is make sure that you reward progress, not just a final outcome. And this is especially important if you're doing an AI launch. A lot of times AI is so new and different for people. You really want to reward them just trying out AI versus just waiting for the implementation to be ready, because it can lead to burnout, and they could just kind of just lose interest by the time the implementation is out. So make sure that you're rewarding them along the way. And then tie recognition to desired behavior. So make sure that you're always highlighting the specific actions that help the transition, rather than just giving general praise. And just really recognizing those employees that are helping others, maybe they're training, and even those that are providing some of that constructive feedback along the way. Ensure fairness and accessibility. Our recognition strategy should be inclusive to maintain morale. So, for example, let's say you have a team of people, some are salaried, some are hourly, and you decide, hey, we're going to give them a day off because of all of the work they've done trying to go through this change. But the hourly people have to make up the time. And so they got to work additional hours to take that day off. Whereas the salary people can just take it off and they're going to get paid. Well, that probably is not going to feel really equitable to those other people. So you want to make sure that everyone feels that they're being involved and they're being treated fairly with whatever recognition you're giving. And then lastly, you want to align it with company values. So when giving out any recognition or rewards, always try and connect it back to one or more of your company values, because that's going to really help strengthen your organization's culture, and it helps reinforces the behaviors that your company cares most about. Okay, so we are getting to the end. I'm going to just kind of wrap some things up. So just as a recap of what I discussed. So we first started off by acknowledging the psychological effects of change. And I think the big key there was our brains want to avoid threats and seek rewards. We explored the foundational change resistant strategies. So think about that commitment curve. It's kind of like your blueprint to getting them to ownership. And then we looked at some of those change resistance tools that are foundational. So it's, the readiness assessments, the communication, doing some of those persona mappings, and then leveraging recognition and rewards. And so one last interactivity for me, I'd like to ask you all to take your phones out again. And I just ask, what's one concept for today that you will commit to the next time you have to lead a team through change? And it can be anything. Yes, recognition. All right, let's see. Recognition is really big. I'm glad you all picked up on that. Like I said, it's so underutilized. We're so focused on the goal that we don't even take time to thank people for going through a change. Communicate regularly. Let's see. Scarf model, yes. Let's see. Readiness surveys, reassurance. Someone just said brain. Yeah, sometimes it's just understanding what is going on because when you see it as something that's neurological, you approach the situation a little bit differently. So I think that's great. You have transparency, continued check-ins, absolutely. And check-in too, even after the change is deployed. Um, as a change leader, I really try to check in. I may not always do it directly. I may work with the leaders to do that. But I don't want to leave people hanging after that. So, all right, great. So a lot of good stuff here. I want to thank you all. So there's a few more things. I'm going to hand it back over to Beth, and we're going to move forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Duriel, for presenting on this topic. A lot of food for thought for me, especially certainty, autonomy, control, really recognizing that in your team and the changes that they may be feeling or fears. That was really that really resonated a lot with me. So thank you so much for presenting on this very important topic. We will now move into the Q&A portion of the webinar. But before we do, we have a short two-question poll regarding today's webinar. And this poll is appearing on your screen right now for you to complete. We really appreciate your feedback as it helps to continue improving both our webinar topics as well as the production of our webinars. So please use the QR code on this slide to access this Q&A, this short survey, and provide us with your valuable feedback, and we really appreciate that. Please use the QR code in the chat that Courtney will provide. This is a link to the full survey, and you can get to that full survey at z.umn.edu/UM webinar survey. So if you're interested in giving us a little bit more feedback, we would really appreciate it. We read your feedback very closely and take your feedback into consideration for our future webinars. So I'm going to pause for a second to give you time to complete the survey. And thank you for your feedback. Now I'll move into the Q&A, and I would say, Duriel, we have about 8 minutes for questions. And so I will take a look through these questions. We've received a lot of great questions. Some of them are situational, so I'll try to condense those situations so I can kind of get to the meat of the questions, but people have very specific situations that they're encountering around change resistance, and these are all really, really great questions. Let's see. I'm going to start with the question, how do you distinguish between genuine resistance to change and patterns of sabotage that prevent individuals from succeeding, even when change would benefit them? Thoughts on that, Duriel?
That is a great question. And it can be difficult. I think what that takes is you're going to need to really ask questions. And those questions need to be very pointed about what concerns do they have for the change. A lot of times I would ask, what would you do? Or hypothetically, if the outcome was this, how would that change that for you? And a lot of times that'll give you an inclination of they're missing something from the change and that's why they're resisting, or if really regardless of what you do, it's going to just be, it's just really about, I'm just don't want to do the change. I just have kind of have a negative attitude. So it's really about questioning kind of about it. One of the things that I've done too, when I've had people that maybe have been a little bit resistant and I'm not really sure, is I've asked them to become a change champion. Because that allows them to have some stake in the game. And if they're willing to join in, that gives me insight that, hey, maybe they actually are genuinely just having concern and they just want to be part of it. But oftentimes when they're really quick to say, no, I don't want to be part of that, that kind of gives me also insight that maybe it's something else. But it's really difficult. It just takes a lot of discussion and giving them some different options. So think about a kind of autonomy.
Fantastic. And I see the webinar survey popping up on your screen. So please take a moment before you leave today to complete our survey. Duriel, our next question. How soon to begin preparing employees for a big change, especially when things can change, no pun intended, along the project or the process?
I always say the earlier, the better. Um, the key, though, is making sure that you have enough information to not leave them being confused or not know what's going on, right? So you want to have enough details, even if you don't have everything. You may not know when it's going to roll out. You may not necessarily know exactly how their role is going to change, if their role is going to change. But if you have enough to say, here's a timeline about when we anticipate it's going to happen, here's the reasons why we're doing it. You want to go ahead and get that as soon as possible. But don't just leave it there. Let them know that, hey, I'm going to be coming back to you in a week with some additional information. And here's either I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to point you to the site, whatever it is, you want to give it out. So the longest you can do that, the better. I think too often I've seen it where, hey, there's a new system rollout and it's happening in a couple weeks and no one was prepared and we just kind of relied on training and thinking training is going to solve everything for them. So the longer the leeway, the better.
Awesome. So, a little bit of a tricky question for you, Duriel. What are your recommendations when a change initiative has gone poorly? What next?
That's a great question. And I think it's really going to depend on why it went poorly. I think the first thing that you have to really assess, was it the change strategy that made it an issue, or was it the project itself? Right. And so sometimes you have to really kind of look at it. Sometimes it's the project went totally fine, it was on point, but maybe some of the tactics really just didn't help people along on that change journey. So you really have to distinguish between that. If it's something that has something to do with the train strategy, then think about going back to that change curve. You kind of have to go back to the beginning, right? You have to kind of already go back to that awareness phase and almost kind of start that over. So kind of going back to the reasons for the change, uncovering kind of those reasons. It may be doing a focus group, it may be doing a survey, or it may be crystal clear what that is. And then you're going to have to work with the business to utilize some of those things. But I will say doing change management reactively is really difficult, which is why I focus so much on trying to do everything you can in the beginning so that you don't have to do it all over. But I think the key is really distinguishing between, is it the project or is it the change or is it a bit of both? And if it's a bit of both, then you kind of want to partner with those project teams to think of a strategy.
Great. So this is a little bit of a different angle and taking into consideration the multi-generational teams that many of us work in. How much should I change my approach and messaging when introducing change within a multi-generational team and perhaps different age groups as well?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Um, and you don't want to necessarily make too many assumptions, especially in a work environment of this
Mhm.
person's in this age group, they're not going to get it. You want to consider that. Think about what their role is. And when it comes to communication, I always try to find out, how are they used to being communicated today? Right? So if they're used to, for example, if they're used to getting their information from a SharePoint site, then you probably want to leverage that because that's what they're used to today. If you have some kind of fancy app that they've never used before and you're going to throw that out there, you may want to think about, is this really going to be right? It's really about what do they use today, and not so much necessarily about the multi-generational, especially for the internal audience that you have. It's really about how are you gonna, who's gonna have like the biggest wave, and what change manage, or sorry, what communication tools are they used to using today? Because I've tried to, really do some fancy things sometimes, and it's really was cool, and then no one ever used it because they just weren't used to utilizing that. And so what that comes down to is really focusing with those leadership groups and really understanding certain groups. Like for example, I work with tech teams, and I know if it's a tech team, I know I can probably use some of those technology things a little bit better because they're just going to be used to that. I know they're going to go on. If I use AI, they're going to adapt to it quickly. But with another team, they may not. So I would think of it more in terms of that versus kind of generation.
Excellent. So we've all learned some strategies that you have presented with us today, some really helpful tips. This question is, if leadership is charging forward with major changes, how do you help them get them perhaps to slow down and follow more of the approaches that you've outlined today?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And I think that's always the biggest challenge when doing change in a business environment. It moves super fast. And oftentimes people have their own milestone, they have their own deadlines that they need to work, and they're not always in line with change management. So you kind of have to ride the train with them. And so a lot of times, as soon as I find out about a change, and hopefully you're on there early enough, think back to that stakeholder template I talked about. Identify those stakeholders quickly. And when I say stakeholders, people that are going to have that high influence, and start setting up a meeting with them immediately to find out what they care about, understand their teams. And then a lot of times I'm going to spend time providing them with some type of leadership playbook that's going to be easy for them to use. You don't want to overcomplicate it because they probably don't have time to go through it. It just may be two or three simple things that I want them to understand and know as they go through the process. And then a lot of times when you're going through a large project, there's not a lot of times for setting up additional meetings. So I try to repurpose meetings that are already in place to kind of share updates, to do check-ins, to give some of those benefits or things to go with during the meetings that already exist. And that's really the kind of the way to keep momentum because you don't want to have them see change management as a burden, right? If they feel it's a burden, then they're not going to, react to that. So you want to kind of just be fast paced, but it is more of an art than a science.
We have so many great questions, Duriel. I think we could spend another hour on all these wonderful questions. So I'm going to pivot a little bit to a situation for a listener who is experiencing a change initiative from an external department. So this is a state agency,
Mhm.
and the team has not been given an adequate, or at least for this listener, enough lead time to manage the change. And there's a lack of clarity in the policy or instructions for the change. This is a common situation for this listener. How do you manage situations where you're taking kind of some direction, um, some guidance from an external resource or source?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm trying to think of most of the change I've done has been internal, but I've certainly have worked with things from an external standpoint. That's going to be a tough challenge. And I think it's where you kind of have to, the best way you can is kind of take the reins and get the questions that you need, right? So it's, I need to do X, Y, and Z. Okay, why? Put that back, put the onus back on them to the best way that you can. Or, hey, I'm really willing to help you do this, but for us to do this, to get to the next phase, I need to understand this. So you're kind of giving them a reason to give you more information or more time, right? If you want me to partner with you, I have to understand that. And so it's really kind of trying to guide them. You're almost kind of like leading them through the change versus the change happening to you so that you get the right direction and information that you can. And also, you have to be honest with them. If you want me to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm not going to have this much time, this is probably the best outcome that I can give you. Are you okay with that? If not, then maybe we have to do things a little bit differently and do it a different way, right? And if they're willing to help you out, then that's going to work out, for you. And if not, then you're going to have to go through that process, but making sure that you're trying to get the best outcome that it is. And a lot of times what you're going to have to do with those agencies is at the beginning, really kind of align on what the success will look like and what are the objectives and really work that way through it. But such a tough challenge with that one.
What I'm hearing in your answer, Duriel, is really trying to take some control back, right? So you
Yes.
have a little bit more autonomy in the situation so you can kind of feel better about moving forward. We are getting to the end of the hour, and as I mentioned earlier, we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions that we have here, and I apologize if we weren't able to get to your question. If this is the case for you and you would like us to pass your question along to Duriel, please send them to ccapsinfo@umn.edu. Courtney will put that email in the chat, ccapsinfo@umn.edu. So please send your question or questions to us and we'll pass those along to Duriel. Thank you so much, Duriel, for your time, your incredibly useful information, and your tools. It's been such a pleasure to have you here today. And you've already put up the next slide. That's wonderful. In addition to supporting individual students and learners, did you know that CCAPS offers flexible workforce development solutions designed to equip groups of employees with the targeted knowledge and the skills your organization needs? Our programs include industry-driven bachelor's and master's programs, as well as more than 18 non-credit certificates and more than 90 individual courses. If you or someone in your organization would like to learn more, please schedule a consultation with me, Beth Laurie, and I welcome the opportunity to discuss learning and development for your employee groups. You can reach me by email at ccapsworkdev@umn.edu. Courtney has put that email address in the chat. And please be sure to visit our website at ccaps.umn.edu/workforce-development. And Courtney has also added that URL in the chat. And the next slide, please, Duriel. As we come to the close, I want to thank you for all of you for joining and listening to our webinar today. And as I mentioned, we will send everyone who registered a link to the webinar recording in about a week of today's webinar. The recording will also be posted to our CCAPS webinar archive website, as well as our CCAPS YouTube page. University of Minnesota employees are also eligible to receive wellness points for listening to our webinars. To redeem your points, please complete the request form at z.umn.edu/CCAPS wellbeing, all one word. And the link to the form for requesting those points is in the chat. Points redemption applies to anyone who listened live today or to a recorded version. If you have questions about the well-being program, the points process, or points status, please email benefits@umn.edu. And our final slide, please, Duriel. To reach out to the college, please give us a call at 612-624-4000, or please email us at ccapsinfo@umn.edu. Please be sure to also visit our website at ccaps.umn.edu. And all of the college's contact information is provided for you here on the slide as well as in the chat. So we're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much again, Duriel. And everyone, have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.